This is the reading of an article titled The Logomachy of the Profane by Ananke Logos. Since time immemorial, there has always been a cultural, societal struggle between two general schools of thought, the realist and the nominalist. The realist in Egyptian, Indian, and Greek cultures uphold metaphysical monism, a non-dualist approach to the apparent dualism that arises from ignorance, to not be able to know and come to understand the fundamental substrate behind the illusions of corporeal being and material becoming are two sides of the same underlying systems, that which cannot be escaped by merely picking one, creationism, or the other, materialism, or both, pluralism, or neither, annihilationism, as real in and of itself. Rather, there is a transcendent explanation to the emanation of the transcendent subject into its lesser modalities. The nominalist mistaken the realist for creationist, or a mere abstraction of creationism, through what's not real, and pigeonhole realism by their own failure to assimilate the transcendent truth for themselves, by making abstracted exceptions to their own rules that they've misinterpreted from, and build upon their own abstractions of reality as if it was reality to justify their unreality of anything that they don't like. In reality, creationism, materialism, pluralism, annihilationism, all four are ultimately nominalism, are the metaphysically profane and duped. Even the translators of Egyptian, Indian, and Greek metaphysical monistic text tend to misinterpret those texts because they lack the golden clavis of understanding to unlock the abductive, retroductive method utilized by the realist to turn away from agnosis itself through the unknowing of all falsehoods. One of these translators had made a grave error in positing that there is one and there is many, as two principles. It's the greatest error of metaphysical nascence that plagues all bean-counting nominalistic mathematicians that have dishonestly substituted limit and unlimit as finite and infinite, and then substituted finite as countable and infinite as uncountable, using materialistic deconstructivism to deny the infinite because it is uncountable, failing to grasp what was the limit and the unlimit in Greek metaphysics, had also deified finite essences to be all that is real and knowable, and infinite essences to be all that is unreal and unknowable. So therefore they foolishly conclude that they live in a finite cosmos made out of finite matter that lasts infinitely, or is comprised of something smaller than traditional matter that lasts infinitely, or is comprised of infinitely infinitesimal scales of matter that last infinitely, to compensate for the hypocritical problems that bean counting has. These people don't grasp the limit, piras, and the unlimit, aparion, are not even fundamentally numbers to begin with. Both are expressions of the extrinsic attribute of the monad. The monad also isn't a number. It is the absolute principle. It cannot be quantified or expressed or externalized directly. The limit and the unlimit are fundamentally unified as different modalities of the same essence of the nous in either agnosis or gnosis. Both modalities are fundamentally necessitated due to the monad, of which the nous in principle is the first divine attribute of the monad, as what the monad does in attribution can only be known as the nous in emanation, prodos, into lesser, weaker realms of manifestation, or the nous in reversion, epistrophe, not merely as, or like, or be, or becoming the monad, but knowing the monad is the self. While all realities, both metaphysical and physical, are seeing modalities of the self as the true self, is in effect the means of emanating the self outside of the self in principle, as the self in attribution and objectively identifying the self as the object becomes into manifest corporeal being and perpetual becomings of becoming for as long as the projection of what the nous sees itself as in and through agnosis of its own modalities of the projected nous, which is the psyche or soul, into, or as the world is the psyche topantos, or the world soul, which is essentially the ether, which is absolutely not to be conflated by Aristotelian ether, which many of these mathematicians do so ever foolishly and never grasp the reality that the ether is fundamentally immaterial, as ludicated upon by some Neoplatonists, which, mind you, even Sri Sankaracharya had understood that the ether is immaterial, since all metaphysical monistic systems are the same in essence. So quoting Aristotle without understanding how the Platonists understood the Platonic form, not merely solid, of the dodecahedron is quite pedestrian to say the least. The wisdom of what the monad isn't objectively comparable to anything at all. The monad is not intellect. It doesn't know, nor can it know. That is the primordial attribute of the monad, is agnosis, which cannot know of anything that is separate from itself. Seeks a self, that which is outside of its knowing, which is absolutely impossible and metaphysically illogical, since you cannot ever truly know of that which is other than the divine principle without knowing it as an attribute of the divine principle. The foundation of all realities hinges upon the monad, and you cannot truly even know of knowing that which you don't know. You can only know that you don't know, which is agnosis. But it is also the beginning of the search of the truth, not the fear of the Lord, not academia, not whatever traditional cultural context you were raised in. To even accept that there is something that we cannot know is to know that you don't know. All that is real is that which can be known. Yet you cannot ever project that into what is apparently real, as in the impermanent modalities of the permanent ether, as matter and light, illumination, are both attributes of the one light, ether in principle. What people conventionally think to be the soul is not really the soul. Rather, the expression of the soul in the modality of the soul, as if it was the permanent self, yet is really the impermanent false self, bound to perpetual change and becoming. As matter is recycled by living beings, and as the soul in agnosis seeks out a new vessel to identify selfness with. Physical matter reincarnates, but metaphysical soul transmigrates after death, seeking mortal living being and becoming of being. That ignorant soul is consciousness. It is a verb. Someone is in the state of consciousness. It seeks to identify itself as that which isn't. Consciousness is the intellect in ignorance, but consciousness dies with the body because it only exists as a corporeal amalgamate of soul and body, psychosoma, of which the body is an impermanent combination of shape, mimesis, and matter, hyal. Combined together is shadow matter, animated by the soul as if it was real. The soul in its ignorance identifies itself as the false self. That is a product of its own becoming of ignorance, generated through the forms and emanation, as amalgamated byproducts of attribution, as shape of matter, projects the false soul that only sees the shadows, and not even the illumination that gives the false shape to the shadows. The disembodied soul, ΝΟΥΣ, still retains its ignorance, becomes a soul-body aggregate yet again. Consciousness is like the light that is illuminating matter, is not light in principle, but light in attribution as illumination. Without illumination, there is no matter to even see. But trying to see the light in principle cannot be done, since the principle of light is not its attribution of light as illumination. So to illuminate upon what is light, one must not think of it as illumination, nor the shadows that illumination creates through the form of the matter. Nor is it the fire that is used within the cave of ignorance for the puppet masters to use its illumination to project the shadow puppets on the wall of becoming. To escape the false light of its own making, one must first disobjectify from that which is not the self before the synthesis of that which is the knowledge of the self and the knower of the knowledge, to be beyond both. Only knows that thou art not in becoming something other than who you are. Not as if it's separate from you to somehow mystically become other than you. Neither is this knowing existential knowing of trivial factoids retained by your existential memory banks on your fleshy, fatty, neural network hardware and software called your brain. All lies retain a hidden truth to hide the truth from you, just as all misapprehensions to build upon what is true even if it's not fully true, because its foundations aren't true, despite how honest and earnest one is in deeply thinking it is true, and not even lying to others that they think it is true. Some aspects are based upon something that is true, but is also a failure to dig beneath the superficial surface, to come to the root of the understanding, because they aren't thinking clearly. Physical forms, rupa, feelings, vedana, perceptions, sana, experiences, sankhara, consciousness, vijnana, are not the self, namesoata. Metaphysical recollection, anamnesis, to the Platonic forms isn't to those aggregates of corporeal existence that the soul identifies with. It is apophatically negated, via negativa, neti, through Platonic retroduction, which is neither the inductive nor deductive method, yet has elements of both, but the resultant effect of what is reduced is that which is not the attributes of something. Rather, the principle behind the attributes that are pulled away until there is nothing left to remove without denying the very essence of that something to begin with. And to come to know of that purified essence itself isn't through the affirmations of the objective, repeatable test to be repeatable, for that is objectively irrelevant to the subjective essence of what the truth behind the observation is about. Now, whenever people try to approach the One, they come to know of the One in many, the many in one, and the amalgamation of both, yet can't really know of the One without knowing the expression of the One, and also understanding that the emanation of the One doesn't negate the One in principle. Without the One, there's no many to be generated from. Likewise, the nous is co-eternally inseparable and incommensurate from the One, for there's always an attribute to any principle, while if a principle has no attributes, it is not a real principle, but an attribute of a principle. There's of course a metaphysical limit to the unlimited emanation, which is at a certain point it's just nothing. But there's no knowing of nothingness, since there's always a subject witnessing a lack of essence from what they observe, yet they are in that nothing, so it's not nothing. There is no nothing, which the reification of attributional byproducts of magnitude combined into its own false entity as space-time is ultimately one of the 5 aggregates to corporeal existence that isn't real in and of itself, as in principally real, only apparently real because there's a truer principle behind the abstracted attributions, which are not even real attributes from real principles. Which attribute reification of what's not even a principle as a principle is nothing short of thinking there's little men behind the television screen. These mathematicians can't even look at Plato's divided line without misinterpreting what it's saying. They misinterpret the very idea behind it, and so don't even grasp what Plato's cave allegory is about, because it's all intertwined. You cannot know Plato's cave allegory without knowing how to divide the line to begin with, in its essence, and not being a legalistic moron that ignores the underlying proportionality to make the divided line segment to be proportionally valid, which is something that people who are stuck in base 10, or really any base numerical system, can't think outside of a finite, limited measuring scheme, can't think in terms beyond numerology, can't even grasp basic geometry, since they cannot ever fathom nor accept that all geometric lines are conceptual and not physical at all. Drawn lines are merely physical representation of that which is non-physical, immaterial. So the notion of arbitrarily dividing a line and dividing those segments into the same proportions as the first division is inconceivable and impossible indefinitely just because it can't be done physically. They have never ever constructed proportionate triangles using Thales' theorem before, and that is in part due to the failure of modern academia. These people are always thinking numerically and measuring in limited measuring systems that only measure limits. These systems are limited by their own illogically self-imposed limitations. Nature fundamentally uses no numbers to measure what is immeasurable, yet asserts that nature is finite and countable because only atoms exist, yet they cannot even count the number of atoms that empirically exist using their own two hands without resulting to approximations and algorithms that are empirically unproven. No one has nor will be able to objectively verify how many atoms are in the physical cosmos, period. It's objectively unknowable, uncountable, ergo, it is infinite or extensively indefinite. You can never define definitively how many atoms there are in the physical cosmos. It is the unlimited, beginningless, endless. There's no objectively knowable, verifiable beginning to the universe without knowing the all, many, are one. Ergo, there's only one unlimited, only one universe. But that isn't to say that there are by any means a countable number of atoms in the universe, because all that is real is finite according to these imbeciles. No one can, nor could ever be able to count what is indefinite. Even if you insist that what is indefinite is finite, you cannot know that it is finite to begin with, because you only have a limited perspective within the space of the earth and the time that you're alive. You cannot assert that the universe is finite if you deny infinite, while if you substitute finite as countable, yet you cannot use approximations of what is countable, since that's still cheating and unverifiable. All approximations of how much matter there is in the universe is only really about the locally observable universe. And to assume that the observable universe is the whole universe is also wrong. All estimation of the supposed age of the universe when matter is perpetually created and destroyed by black holes is a fool's errand. The real answer to the age of that which has no objective age, but is also physical, is perpetuated eternity. What is perpetuated eternity? It is by mere attribute, everlasting, because of a greater principle that is truly eternal in principle, because it is beyond the measuring of the magnitude which gives the attributes of both spatial and temporal systems. Though time is only experienced because there is impermanence in reality that goes through the process of decay, which in the minds of these fools cannot ever conceive of the answer to this, even if they don't posit a beginning to the universe. They do still hold onto the notion of an inevitable end to the universe without ever being witness to that end which will not come. There is no past nor future to the divine. All is now. But we only, by vain grasping onto aggregate experiences, perceive that there is a past and that there will be a future. Of course, this isn't the denial of the experience of time itself. Rather, the denial of that perpetuated time expressed through space from different objective reference points that's bound to decay, since matter itself is impermanent and ultimately destructible by any means being real, in and of itself. For time is merely the measuring of material and immaterial processes, using some objective reference point, which again, objects aren't truly eternal, while life itself is even more unstable and ephemeral of an existence than the matter it is objectively comprised of. So the grasping onto materiality as if it was eternal is in part what perpetuates the suffering of the soul. If you destroy matter, what is left? Light as illumination. There are no charge-carrying particles, so there is no electron. While so-called photons are ultimately transverse waves, waves of the ether itself, usually as high-energy gamma rays. The modality of the ether merely shifts into another modality of the ether. Both waves and particles are phenomenal modalities of the ether. There are fools that look at electromagnetic field vectors and claim there's an electron-positron pair, when for one, the only fundamental matter is the proton, and two, electrons aren't particles. So there's no pair of non-classical quantum particles. There's merely an ether torsion field pressure mediation towards homeostasis. There can never be a truly objectively quantifiable verification of light as matter, even if one supposes that electrons are physical when they're not, because they're ultimately just observations of ether electrostatic dielectric discharges, measured in electrovolts, falsely named as electron volts, while electricity is a byproduct of the magnetic field moving against the dielectric field at a certain frequency, or in other words, ether torsion. How can that which is supposedly smaller than matter affect matter as if it was matter? It can't. It would require far too many smaller particles to affect the larger classical matter, and it therefore won't ever be a one-to-one representation of matter versus electron, while the very means to detect it uses a flawed medium of silver halide crystal grains of various sizes that individually get affected by a wide range of frequencies. Yet again, it takes a considerable amount of dielectric discharge bombardment from light frequencies to have one grainy part of the film to be exposed and become a tiny speck of illuminated film among many. You cannot use such means to, by any means, claim that light is a particle. These are the same idiots that claim that two photons, after filtering out billions upon billions of photons, prove the existence of the Higgs boson. Similarly, the muon neutrino was discovered by cherry-picking from hundreds of trillions of events, only 29 events, that the muon neutrino was the most likely interpretation of the observed events. Ultimately, these people only see what they want to see and never question their own asinine axioms and necessitate in their own ignorance that it all has to be some form of physical particle. Yet no metaphysically hyperlogical question ever goes on in the minds of these fools. They never question why the very premise of what they're searching for is fundamentally flawed. Matter cannot be a standing wave, nor can standing wave centers be a particle. Matter therefore isn't a standing wave, because ultimately it is a particle in essence, negating the notion that matter is by any means a standing wave. Matter and particle cannot be flexibly interchanged without asserting that non-existent subatomic particles to be matter in denotation, while the means of concluding the very existence of subatomic particles is obtained through severely flawed science, whose practitioners see things as they wish to see them, by ignoring anything and everything that speaks against their non-existent methodology via brute force ignorance, is ultimately reified compounded ignorance as the truth, which the access to the raw data is not allowed by the general populace. So all in all, no one will find the answers to the problems facing physics through traditional means of going through a college or university education and working in the field, because most everyone around you is lying to you that they do know, yet cannot remain hyperlogically consistent at all levels. Since the universe, by metaphysical reduction, is beginningless and endless attributionally, due to the monad being truly eternal, makes the nous in agnosis, rea, magnitude, co-eternal by virtue of the divine principle, as to have at least one attribute, which is also known as the aoristos dyad, or the nous in gnosis, that knows of itself as the monad, is liberated from its attributional ignorance of not knowing anything else that is not the self, because it knows that all is the self in lesser emanations of the self, in principle, as the self in attribution, that doesn't know itself, as the self in principle. Since the universe always existed and always will exist, the universe cannot be expanding at all, because it is everything. Expansion is merely an illusion of the fact that the longer the Earth exists, the more light from existing stars reaches Earth. But assuming one can be on a point in space outlasting the lifespans of galaxies themselves and using a near-perfect telescope to observe the stars and galaxies that are almost as innumerable as the stars themselves, to the point of not knowing if it's a star or a galaxy, since you don't have an ideal perfect telescope, which cannot exist, of course. All the far-out stars only appear redshifted because they're far away, not because the universe is expanding, but because there is a limit to how light can propagate without being distorted and slowed down by nearby masses in the line of sight that contort the light before it reaches the observer. So of course, going through various masses through space, not all light from the stars would ever truly be visible at any point in the universe. There has to be some limit where you cannot see any light from beyond a certain distance. Generally and conceptually speaking, due to the infinite masses that are in your way, there are infinitely more masses you don't see and never will see. I have two original theories based upon the nature of the universe. The first theory is that because magnets, and all masses in general, mutually accelerate towards a barycentric counterspatial sink in between the two masses, as seen in numerous ferrocell visualizations of the magnetic point source field emanation of the coherent dielectric field of the polarized subject, since the objective mass comprising the object hasn't changed in quantity. It is a qualitative change of the dielectric subject of the ether itself bound to the coherent point. And knowing that there is a magnetic field bridging between galaxies due to the ether torsion generated by the galactic masses, especially its supermassive black holes, at a sufficient distance between two galactic masses of relatively high densities, they are accelerated towards each other, but both galaxies having enough inertia to resist that dielectric acceleration. The counterspatial sink at a multi-galactic level is generated between the two galaxies, creating a black hole. Yes, I know they're neither black nor that they are holes, but I'm using black holes to conventionally communicate to you as to what we're referring to. The second theory is that since the universe is unlimited, apeiron, and since galaxies tend to be clustered in tendril-like formations, but is ultimately homogeneously distributed randomly at very huge distances, approaching infinity, thereby debunking fractal symmetrical ordering at the universal infinite scale. I propose that all galactic supermassive black holes are merely the lowest pressure lines of the universe, that at the supercluster scale are formed like the lines formed between bubbles that touch each other. The bubbles of the universe being the so-called voids where there's a lack of galaxies. I would imagine that trying to go inside those voids is hard to do, and it's much easier to move between nearby galaxies. Some voids are large, some are small, but according to this theory, they are high-pressure zones that make the genesis of matter via supermassive black holes harder than forming from nearby galaxies in my first theory, due to how my theory is more localized, and by the fact that space ultimately has no properties in and of itself, because space itself is a property of magnitude and magnetism. So ultimately, I'm claiming that supermassive black holes therefore are themselves formed from the reciprocal limitless magnetic force of the universe against itself, unmanifest. A counterspatial sink to mediate universal inertial homeostasis at a certain proportion that we might never truly know but can approximate, at the very least ponder about, but it's still nevertheless always at a net of zero, for even matter itself gives rise to the existence from the point source emanation from the dielectric inertial point source, which scales from matter to magnets, to pulsars, to black holes, to supermassive black holes, a very high dielectric field that overtakes the magnetic field of a mass through its inverse field reciprocation of its gyromagnetic precession, emits and generates mass and high-energy gamma-ray light, since gamma rays at a certain threshold become compressed into a point where light merely goes through itself against itself as a simple torus, generates a dielectric point source, is no longer bound to the process of the frequency or cycles of its own perturbation of compressions and rarefications of light waves. Conceptually, therefore, can it be applied to the universe? Are we living inside a toroidal universe? No, we're not, because that would imply a limit to the unlimited nature of the nous in agnosis. You cannot escape a field outside a field without that outside being a location, which therefore means there's a field. There cannot be a location that's not within the physical universe, for location is based on an objective reference point. For as long as there's an object, the idea of the location also is apparently real, as the object used to deduce the notion of location. Some of these bean-counting goons even deny that, which is really pathetic to say the least. While I'm at it, large masses, like say planets, seek to become slightly oblate spheroids, bulging at their sides due to rotation. Plasma is merely highly ionized gas particles by the high-energy environment generated by high-energy gamma rays, which explains why galactic jets not only have plasma but also gamma rays. Plasma, therefore, is fundamentally just a different state of matter, not even a different modality of the ether. Light isn't a rope, nor matter a bunch of ropes in a knot that somehow magically push and pull against itself and other rope knots, and that analogy is very flawed and bound to be a mental ideation of a physical rope that doesn't function like a physical rope. Yet it uses terminology that implies that it is physical, when it cannot really explain how the illumination from the electrified filament of a light bulb works when it is in an airtight vacuum, without somehow claiming that there's invisible infinite ropes twisting the rope knot atoms comprising the glass to slow down when it's twisting inside of the glass, yet speed back up when leaving the glass, without violating the law of conservation of energy. All light bends around masses. It's just that coherent masses, i.e. black holes and magnets, are generally more prominent in displaying this fact. Though I don't believe in so-called Einstein rings, light nevertheless is affected by matter only if the light passes through the immediate magnetic field of the mass, which the plasma ionized gas of the sun is what is causing the bending of light rays around the sun. But there are images of visually distorted galaxies due to the magnetic fields of other masses. Our sun is mostly comprised of metallic hydrogen, but in its core, it's probably not hydrogen at all. Everyone is speculating about various things, and even a broken clock is right twice a day, but only a few people are metaphysically consistent and somewhat know the futility of trying to know the objectively unknowable nature of objective paradoxes that cannot be objectively verified. It's like a reverse broken clock, wrong twice a day. Right every other time of the day, since ultimately no one is right about everything there is to know about physics and objective reality. But a very few people are right about metaphysics, and even fewer know what is wrong about current physics, and have also come to a better understanding of what is true physics, guided by monistic metaphysics. Most of my corrected understanding is based on Kenneth Wheeler's work, but I don't think he has explained why galaxies are clustered in tendril-like formations. That's my own thing. And it is somewhat falsifiable, given that in order to test it, you have to have a very powerful spaceship that can travel at extremely high velocities, exponentially beyond the maximum rate of induction, which is conventionally known as the speed of light, as well as equipment that can detect faster and light velocities, to travel fast enough to test the space turbulence, but not so slow that you wouldn't be able to notice the change of velocity while moving through various voids. It's not falsifiable, but it's not unfalsifiable. Assuming that no civilization on any life-sustaining planet can ever achieve this, I encourage everyone to help me help you understand what you don't understand, and vice versa, and especially to those who recognize some of the sources I've used in this article, since some of those people are right in some things, which what they get right I've used in this article, but are still nominalist, that have a muddled, unclear mind due to the stupefying effects of material existence in general, so they're still ultimately wrong in other aspects briefly mentioned all over this article. But alas, there's no end to the collective ignorance of the people. Neither the realist nor the nominalist will overcome the other for an eternity. But we are indeed in the intellectual dark ages manufactured by the nominalist that persecute the realist in many ways, more than one, all by their false axiomatic presuppositions.